We're doing it. Welcome to the Final Parsec podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Bear, and today
And
we are going to be talking about dialogue in video games, sticking with the world building theme that we've had the last podcast and probably for the next one or two. I guess we'll see where we go with it.
uh, so I guess, what do you think are some of the games that have the best dialogue?
Best dialogue, man, that's a tough one. I know, like, I guess the first thing that comes to mind with me that's really done a good storytelling and has good dialogue was World of Warcraft. Though I think maybe it's more cutscenes than that and less like the actual in-game play that I'm really referencing and enjoying. I don't know if you've played much of that one, have you?
No, only
Yeah.
what we've played.
Yeah, I think the that's true. Yeah, we played a little bit of that together back in the day. But I think what gets me there is the cutscenes. They're super cinematic and there's just like this really rich lore that surrounds all of these different characters and I think they do a good job with dialogue. It a lot of the time, and I think especially in the earlier part of Warcraft, it was really good storytelling, and that's the biggest aspect that pulled me in was just liking to see that. What about you? What games did you like?
So I really liked playing the Final Fantasy series,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they have it. It shows a really good evolution of world building and storytelling, and even the dialogue has a progression. So you play the first Final Fantasy, and you're just, oh, you're these uh, I don't even remember, crystal warriors, and
Mm-hmm.
go over here, find these crystals. Oh, yay, you saved the kingdom. And then it just progresses. The stories get more intricate. The players or the characters get more developed, and it's really cool to be able to see that. And I like that there's so much you can do with dialogue, especially if in just the written form.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to worry about voice acting or things like that. You can really tell a good story. Uh, and even the I like Banjo Kazooie, the way that they did the dialogue in that, where it's just uh, verbal. There's no voice acting, but or for the words, but there is just audio whenever text is playing.
Oh yeah. Well, that's
And
what we did for Venom event, which I think was a pretty easy way to get started with something. I think we so for those who haven't played the game, we basically wrote out a script and then we just kind of had a typewriter sound that would roll as the script would play, and we'd show it next to a portrait of the character, and we basically use that in its entirety to move the plot along.
oh yeah,
So it's a really low cost, low effort way, but still I think a good way to keep a story moving without having to like put this overt narration on top of it or uh, having to hire a voice actor or do that stuff on your own. You can just kind of get a good story going and have characters growing and moving along. But I guess there's a drawback too. You want to be careful about as you get into dialogue is not doing too much because like you want it to just be something that helps push the game and make the game feel more immersive. But you're not writing a novel and you're not telling a story. I mean, I guess you're telling a story, but you're not writing a story in the traditional sense. Like for that to be the only thing. Um, when you're making a game, I mean, you're trying to push forward a cool mechanic or like a fun experience. Um, and dialogue is just one small part of that to make it feel like a big comprehensive experience.
yeah. You really want it to drive the action forward, not so much take the player out of what they were trying to do in the game.
Yeah. I know I know I've been there where you're just like hitting the skip button sometimes and just some games, and I feel like this a little bit in Harry Potter, which I think has good examples of dialogue, but also has another problem too, which we can talk about in a bit. But I think it's a bit verbose sometimes, where I'm just sitting there like I can read it faster than these voice actors can go through it, and it's like taking me a little bit out of what I'm doing. And sometimes I'll kind of finish a quest, and I'll just be prompted to go and talk to somebody without really having to bring anything to them or do anything. And yeah, and I think in those cases, it's not as valuable to write dialogue that way.
Yeah, having skippable uh, dialogue is another uh, odd choice, or something that I think we need to work around, because
Mm-hmm.
if your dialogue is getting skipped, then the players aren't interested in it, and that's taking away from the story and the world that you're trying to present. So I wonder what are some of the ways that we can try to make dialogue more interesting or less intrusive to the player.
Well, I think it's like if you make the dialogue just like a cutscene where you literally can't play at all, it's basically a requirement at that point that you have to have it skippable. Otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to frustrate people. But if you keep everything in game and you can still like move around or just walk away from the conversation, then I think it becomes a lot better in some senses. Though
Yeah.
you can't do that necessarily with dialogue that is like moving your main plot along,
Right.
because you need people to hear it, I guess, or at least have the opportunity to hear it, right?
Yeah, and that's a great point. I like the idea of not having too many cutscenes, not having a lot of cutscenes, and doing more of the dialogue actually in the gameplay.
Yeah.
I think a game that does that probably the best is the Last of Us series. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
they you can just move towards characters, and there's a lot of audio cues and events that you can just miss completely if you want to just bulldog your way through a
Yeah,
game.
well, and that's how some people want to play a game. They
Mm-hmm.
don't care. They don't want to stop and talk to people. They just want to fight through,
Yeah,
you know? And particularly if you're the kind of person that wants to play it a second or third time, you may not want to engage with those people at all.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that gets to our one of our articles, which is leaving room for mystery. It's kind of the iceberg theory. You want to
Yeah,
only show 10%, or and then leave the rest for the player to kind of interpret on their own.
absolutely. And I think that's super important too if you've got like a more open world style game or like a sandbox type game where the player has opportunity to walk around and kind of dig into mystery on their own or look into side quests. The less you say on like that main path conversation, the more opportunity you leave for players to just go and dig into that stuff on their own, which I think makes for a much better experience. If you hear like some kind of small subtext or side comment that's like a little mysterious and you're like, what's he talking about? Like they make mention of maybe there's a treasure somewhere and you're just like, oh, maybe I need to go to that area and start talking to people and see what I can find. I think that stuff is really engaging.
Yeah, that's really a rewarding experience as a
Mm-hmm.
player to have found something that wasn't really obvious, but was put there for you to find.
Yeah, I think like Red Dead Redemption 2 did it probably,
Mm-hmm.
well, everything in that series did a really good job of that, where they would, because they had such this like huge world, and then you'd hear like little references in conversation with somebody about like a character in another city or like something that you may find or do elsewhere, and that would kind of prompt you to go and look for it. I think there's so I made mention there was one thing that I didn't like about Harry Potter's dialogue that I wanted to talk about too. So I want to bring that up, and that was if you're giving players choice in dialogue, you should try your best to make it meaningful. I find in the Harry Potter example, they give you these choices, or I guess Hogwarts Legacy, it's not called Harry Potter, but they give you these choices and you can kind of like make a snarky comment to a character or you can be nice and it's fun. I mean, I personally always like to be snarky or evil. Like that's just kind of how I like to play games. I think it's fun, but it hardly changes anything. You might get like one kind of snide comment back from the character that you're talking with, but it doesn't change the storyline. It doesn't have any sort of impact on like good or evil for your character. Um, but then you've got games like Fable and stuff too, where like the decisions you make as a character and how you interact with other people are just so much more impactful. And I think that's the right way to do it. If you're going to give people the opportunity to kind of choose your own adventure and change the way that you talk with other people and the dialogue and the conversations that you have, make it meaningful, make it actually do something.
Yeah, I think I agree. The just the illusion of choice in those sorts of games. I think Fallout is guilty of this a little
Mm-hmm.
bit also, where you have a lot of choices of what you can say, but nothing
Yeah,
really
it's the same
changes.
game either way.
Yeah, but and then you brought up Fable. That is a very good example of what you were talking about. I really like the way that Fable has that progression of characters. You can either be good, you can be
Yeah.
bad, and even your character's appearance changes in that game.
Disappointingly, though, I guess there was no actual dialogue, right? I think I'm remembering that the main character didn't talk at all.
Oh,
I
see, I
think.
never actually played Fable
Yeah.
or played a lot of Fable. I'm
I'm trying
going
to
off of what
remember.
you've told me.
Yeah. I think, well, I'm thinking of the original Fable. I think that one didn't
Mm.
have any conversation, though I can't recall.
And that's a whole other topic: how to drive storytelling through actions
Yeah.
instead of dialogue.
Yeah. Maybe a topic for another podcast, right? Let's see. I think we hit most of the topics. The tone and style, I guess that's one that I think was is kind of important too. Though I'm not sure I can come up with a good example. Maybe you can. But I think it is nice to see characters change based on the context they're in. So if you're like a really boisterous character in certain circumstances and maybe you're quiet later on, that can really tell a lot about what you're scared of or what you value as a character. If you quiet down and you're in a conversation with, like, I don't know, a villain or something, you can show just by virtue of the change in behavior that you know, that person's fears and values and all that stuff, and see just a different side of it without having to be too overt and say
Mhm.
it directly.
Yeah, going through uh, having supporting, what we were just talking about, even having supporting actions that kind of really drive the dialogue and some of the meaning behind it. So yeah, if your character uh, has a fear of something and that fear comes up, that it shouldn't be ignored. They're not going to act the same
Yeah,
around it.
yeah. Imagine if they just barreled into conversation all the same, right? Like, if you're afraid of spiders and that's the case, you're not going to just have a spider in the room and be ready to have a normal conversation like everything is fine. Um, but you'll still have a conversation, obviously. Just think about it. I mean, in real terms, if if a certain character was in a certain situation, how would they react? How would they talk, and all of that? And I think uh, the more you think about that kind of stuff as you go through your script, the more believable it's going to become. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it does take a lot of like revision and stepping through and just hearing it yourself to make sure that it feels natural and that you're making something believable.
Mm-hmm. And I think we might have touched on this, but I like the having all the dialogue that you make there should be a purpose for it. So I think there's this there's I'm not a dialogue expert or storytelling expert by any means, but I believe there's this concept called Chekhov's gun,
I haven't heard of that. What is that?
where so I've heard of it more in a cinema setting.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's ever a gun in a movie, the
Oh
gun is
yeah, it's
going to go
important, right?
off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, what is that? Shaun of the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
There's a gun in the bar, and it's shown, and then it's used later. It gets fired.
Yeah.
So you should never have useless dialogue, I think, is really what a good takeaway from that is. It should be there to drive the story and should have a purpose.
I completely agree. I mean, you don't want somebody to just say something inane or like bring up some aspect of their childhood and then just have no importance to the rest of the game at all.
Yes,
I mean,
it's
that's just
very
going to confuse
frustrating as a
people.
player.
Yeah. Well, because yeah, I mean, as soon as you hear something like that, you're going to be thinking about it and trying to look at it probably as like a means of foreshadowing
Mm-hmm.
or somehow tying it in. And if it doesn't have anything to do with the game, you're probably just going to make them think. I mean, I guess it depends on the genre of game you're making, but you're probably going to make people think that you're like putting a puzzle in there
Mm-hmm.
or some sort of brain teaser that they have to think through, which is not quite fair unless you want to mess with people. But I don't know.
And I think the Saw series, or at least a few of them that got a little out there in the later movies, but Saw was pretty good at trying to trick the player, doing truthful dialogue, but having it be interpreted in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good example of that.
But, I think we've about covered everything. What do you think?
I think so. I think we hit it.
All right.
So,
Well,
yeah. You want to sign us off?
I'll sign us off.
All right.
Thanks for watching. We'll be back with another one next week.
All right. Thanks, everybody.